Hello, and welcome to Ending Physician Overwhelm. I'm your host, Dr. Megan Mello. I'm a family and obesity medicine physician, as well as a certified life coach for physicians. In this podcast, we talk about how the learned habits of people-pleasing, perfectionism, and a lack of boundaries show up in our lives and how they contribute to burnout, exhaustion, and overwhelm. The healthcare system is broken, my friends, but let's not wait for it to be fixed in order to feel better. Hello, my friends, and welcome to another episode of Ending Physician Overwhelm. I'm your host, Dr. Megan Mello. So this episode drops in the last week of August 2025. In my part of the country, which is on the West Coast, we tend to go back to school after Labor Day, although that's not, of course, true for all of us. I know many of you may be in a place in the country where school goes back sometime in mid-August, which is just bonkers to me, but that is obviously a difference. And as we're preparing for going back to school, it came to me just this thought of learning. As physicians, we are lifelong learners. We are often people who have been very successful as learners, right? We've done just a crap ton of school. We have taken so many tests. Most of us would consider ourselves professional multiple choice test takers. Some of you have to or did have to do oral boards or some other kind of certification where there is a performance element to it, which makes me grateful for not being a surgeon. I'm not sure if non-surgeons do oral boards or not. As far as I know, that's confined to the surgery space, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, because I really, truly just do not know. But regardless, we have been people who have been heavily engaged in learning for a long time. And after we complete our residency, our fellowship training, of course, there is an expectation that we will continue to learn. And there is institutionalized learning that goes on and on. Of course, some of that is falling in the bucket of mandatory trainings on whatever, right? Those videos that you have to sit through used to be lectures that we had to sit through. But more, I'm thinking of the continuing education sort of pieces where you're expected to complete a certain number of hours. You may go to conferences, you may do online learning, you may do some other kind of program where you're continuously learning something, or at least giving the appearance of learning something, right? Being able to pass a test. But most of us, many of us, enjoy learning. Sometimes to the extent that we will constantly put ourselves in situations where we're learning new things in order to, sort of further kick some can down the road. Example of this is someone who is considering going into private practice or, starting their own business and signs up for course after course after course. Perhaps some of it business focused, perhaps some of it new board certification like lifestyle medicine or obesity medicine, right? And using the learning as once I've done this, right, then I'll feel like I can do that. My business mentor calls that learnitis, right? Kind of the toxification of learning, if you will. But what I want to focus on today is really thinking about who and where you are learning from, and if it's time to make any shifts. When I think about my own medical education in particular, I trained in the early 2000s, and residency was in the latter half of the 2000s. Most of my lectures were coming from white men, older white men. Yes, we had some lecturers that were women. Yes, mostly white as well. Mostly senior and mostly academic. So we sat through many, many lectures. Moving into residency, I went to a non-academic program. Although, again, most of my teachers were older white men. So I, like many people, am used to learning from older white men in particular, who tended to read New England Journal and perhaps JAMA, and this very traditional set of papers, journal articles, um, the same sort of conventional resources over and over again. And as I have evolved, as I have been widening my own lens throughout my career, I find myself wanting to learn more and more from people who are outside of that old white male bucket, and being able to learn things that are not necessarily things that we would have learned about in medical school. Obesity medicine, menopause medicine, those are great examples, right, of things that are not traditionally well taught, not traditionally focused on in the study of medicine, but wanting to learn from people who are actually in the trenches, who are actually providing the care, providing excellent care in the way that I want to be able to do that as well. Looking at people who have blazed a trail in some element of this, right? They have been leaders in the space and they've actually been doing the work. And I'm grateful that in both of these areas of medicine where I find myself becoming more and more specialized, there is a lot of women who have blazed the path and have become leaders in these fields and are giving us so many opportunities to learn from them. I'm very grateful for that, because we need more voices. We need more diversity of voices out there. We also need to break up the entrenchment of old white men as the be all end all of medicine. Medicine is historically, like so many institutions, has been highly patriarchal. It has been racist. It has been sexist and misogynist, and with all the biases. And we aren't going to shed all of those easily, and certainly does not seem like we are going to make any strides in those places with this administration. But one of the ways that we start to break up this traditional model is by raising up the voices, right, who are not that traditional pathway. And so I want to think, as we talk today, about who are the voices that you want to learn from? How are you seeking them out? What is helpful when you are looking for branching out of whatever box you've been in? And that could be for people who are early in their career. It could be for people who are somewhere in the middle of their career and looking to add some expertise, to add some extra knowledge, to fill in gaps that they are currently identifying. I think menopause care is a fantastic example of this. So few of us learned anything helpful about menopause. And of course, there's this huge vacuum that happened with the WHI study, making it seem like hormones were going to kill us all. Women were literally throwing their hormones in the toilet because they thought they were going to get breast cancer from these medications. So not only did we not learn about what women in menopause and perimenopause were experiencing because patriarchy, right? But also, we also learn incorrect information. So being able to say, you know what, this is a gap area. This is a place that I want to learn more because my patients are experiencing this. We have to figure out, where am I going to go? Who am I going to listen to? Who is going to help me to retrain, to be able to learn what it is I want and need to learn, and think about this differently. The other element that I'll highlight here that is going on in the United States and perhaps beyond, right, is because our government is actively destroying some of the longstanding institutions, like breaking up the ACIP, which helps to produce vaccine guidance, making serious changes in the CDC, making serious changes at the FDA and our regulatory bodies and removing information about vaccines, about public health, without going in to the politics of it. We are losing resources. And you could say, well, those traditional things weren't so helpful, but while they were not perfect, because of course nothing is perfect, they were giving us very important public health guidance. And with them gone, with people actively leaving because they cannot tolerate the conditions that they are in as the government is blowing things up with science, with bringing in people with a political agenda who are against the establishment. We are seeing a real hollowing out of reliable resources. And so being able to figure out for yourself, all right, some of my trusted resources are going away. Who will I look to for guidance when those things are gone? It's a very disturbing element of part of the challenge of figuring out how will I take care of patients. I think for those of us in primary care, for those of us who spend a lot of time talking with patients about vaccines, this is going to be a very challenging year in the fall of 2025, because right now I'd say that the future of the COVID vaccine and the availability of it to our patients is going to, it's unclear. It's unclear. And I have learned from people who are very knowledgeable, who have recently left posts of position in the CDC, that yes, the evidence was changing. Yes, there was probably going to be a reframe of what the guidance was, but political forces were already blowing things up in such a way that science is no longer going to be dictating what the changes were going to be. Again, my goal is not to devolve into a political conversation, and I don't really care what side of the aisle you're on. There is a fundamental problem when our traditional resources are gobbled up overnight and disappear, leaving those of us who look to resources like the CDC or the United States Preventative Health Task Force, when those bodies have been imploded, where will we turn? Again, the goal here is not to dwell on the politics, but to highlight that one of our challenges in this time and space that is painfully obvious if you're thinking about it at all is I will need to know where I'm going to turn for information, how I'm going to collect information, how I'm going to test and vet it, how am I going to interpret, whether it's studies or guidelines or things that are coming out, because we will be called upon to do that with the stripping out of some of these resources. But also, if you are trying to just take care of patients, maybe the vaccine issue is not pertinent to you, but you do need to figure out, how am I going to continue learning as change happens? I was reading an article in the New England Journal that came out earlier this week, I believe, that was talking about the influence of AI in teaching students and residents, right, our medical learners. And how do we guide them in the use of AI when they as a generation are probably much more savvy on AI in general. However, we as their supervisors might be less familiar with the AI tools, and yet we need to help guide them in using those tools in a way that is safe, evidence-based, and still helping them to learn medicine, still helping them to learn pattern recognition, to be able to answer clinical questions and not just turn to a resource. Now, this question is not new. It's just that the technology has become easier and faster. And gives the illusion of credibility where, it may not have done that before. Now, I think that most of us probably, given the demographics of people who are listening to it that I know, we trained with these little books in our pockets. And these little books in the days before smartphones had a lot of information. And I'm sure that most of us just assumed that these were credible resources. We didn't question the evidence and why, why they presented the information. We took that. We are not going to assume, right, that everything needs to be thought of with that critical lens. But because AI in particular is able to make up things, and if you played around with AI at all, you know that it can make up things, and that's part of the concern. Figuring out how will we guide learners so that they can know how to vet information that they're getting for the safety of our patients. It's a really interesting question. I'll tell you, it made me very grateful that I'm no longer on faculty because it just seems like a big challenge. So if those of you who are listening are on faculty somewhere and you're teaching residents, I applaud you for taking on this challenge, which you didn't get to choose because it's just here. It's just part of the landscape. I myself have been using multiple AI tools within medicine, and I had to try and vet several before I thought they were fit to print. But I don't supervise learners who are using AI to do things. I do supervise learners occasionally, but not to do anything that they need to pull out their AI tools for. It's a very interesting time. But let's just stop and think. So for yourself, knowing that you will continue to do medical education, that you will likely want to continue growing in your skills, developing new skills, figuring out what is interesting and meaningful to you. What will you choose to do? Who will you choose to listen to? Where will you choose to turn so that you can get information that is helpful, that you can grow more and more into the clinician that you want to be? Whether that is becoming more specialized, more generalized, someone who has their own practice, someone who has their own clear boundaries, right? And is taking better care of themselves than they have been able to do in the past, right? We're not just having to focus on clinical information, but if we think about the work that's been done in the last 10 to 15 years on physician, let's throw some buzzwords out here, wellness, physician resilience, physician burnout. How are we incorporating what has been learned about physicians and utilizing it in our own lives, knowing that unfortunately, although we can sit through all the lectures from our employers, we are the ones who have to integrate that self-care information for our lives to feel different because they are not motivated to do that for us. So if we think through where we are in 2025 with what we currently have available, and let's think about traditional resources, and we can throw in our sort of widely credited medical resources. Again, think about New England Journal, think about JAMA, think about the CDC, think about PubMed, think about newer tools like Open Evidence. Figuring out what are those resources that I turn to, and am I able to keep an eye on how those resources are gathering their information? Who is steering the ship? And being mindful of the political influence that is or is not putting information in there so that we can retain a critical eye. So what are those resources for you? And then thinking about, who am I going to listen to who am I going to learn from? I spoke at a conference a little under a year ago. It was in November of 2024. And I shared this closer to that time where I was able to give a talk at this conference and focus on clinical care of patients. What people in the audience, which was a collection of osteopathic physicians, there were internists there and there were OBGYNs there. It was a women's health conference, trying to give them practical information to understand insulin resistance in the health span of women and its impact on obesity and how some of our current treatments would affect insulin resistance, right? It was a very practical, this is why I do things this way, and this is how I take care of patients, all packed into a 30-minute lecture. But the person before me, who was an older white man, gave a very traditional lecture, made some very derogatory statements about people with obesity, had a really inappropriate joke in one of his slides, and gave kind of a state of the union. Here are all the drugs that are coming down the pipeline that we will have access to within the next 5 or so years. And I sat there and I was on the stage facing the audience as he spoke and trying to keep a poker face, but really had the profound connection that I don't want to learn from this guy. I don't want to learn from this model anymore. So although I do subscribe to New England Journal and I do consult it to look at especially papers that are coming out in my field of obesity medicine, because there is a lot of science that is coming out and will continue to do so, I look at these resources as something that I want to keep my pulse on, but the people that I actually learn from in how to do a better job on the ground are the people who are doing the work. The other physicians who are out here in mostly non-academic settings, taking care of real life humans who are not in a tertiary care center with some obscure form of disease that I hope to never see. I want to learn from the people who are really doing the work. And those are the voices that I seek out, that I pay to learn from, that I seek mentorship from. And it has made such a tremendous difference because I don't go into learning situations anymore really just sort of drinking from the fire hose of a lot of information that I'm never going to be able to use. I don't care what the drugs will be 5 years from now until they are much closer to being in my pharmacies where I will use them or not use them based on the lived experience and what I can synthesize from the evidence, right? I don't care what's in the pipeline if it's 5 years from now, because that doesn't help me take care of my patients right now. What I care about is being able to take care of my patients right now, to be able to speak with them like a real human and be able to offer them what I have in the toolbox right now. For yourself, in your situation, what makes sense to you? Who is doing the work and doing the work in the way that you want to be able to do? And how can you learn from them? Are they giving courses? Are they giving lectures? Do they have a podcast? Have they written a book? Figuring out for yourself, who do I learn from? How does that look? And if it doesn't come with CME attached, that's fine. That doesn't mean that we can't learn and put it into practice and research things and, being able to synthesize, how do I incorporate this into what I'm doing with my patients? But especially if some of that is outside of the box of traditional medicine, you're going to need to figure out who are those voices. For myself, I listen to a lot of different medical podcasts, again, mostly from not white male speakers, and people who are practicing medicine mostly in the way that I want to do it. Having good connections with their patients, being able to have discussions, being able to talk about what we know and what we don't know, being able to tell people, with real practical information, what is it like to choose this treatment? What are the costs? And that might be the financial costs, but also the other costs of being on this particular treatment. That is very pertinent to the work that I do in obesity medicine because we have so many expensive drugs that people are using. I want to be able to give my patients the right information, the good, the bad, and the ugly, to be able to figure out, is that an option for them if insurance is not going to reimburse for them? Because that's a whole different podcast in and of itself. But I've sought out the voices who are able to do medicine in that way, to be able to talk through the very practical elements, because that's what I want to be able to do with my patients. And that's what I've been able to institute with them. But for you, what makes the most sense? How will you gain the information? Who will you learn from? How will you figure out what the appropriate cadence is for that learning? Are you open to being challenged? Are you open to learning new things that previously didn't make sense to you? And to being able to sort of crack your brain open a little bit, right? And figure out, oh, that's why people are doing things this way. I'll give you an example of that. When I was practicing just straight up family medicine in traditional employed practice, I would see some of my patients who were on metformin, for example, who did not have diabetes. I might have been aware that they had prediabetes. I might not have. They might have been an insulin resistance, which is pre-diabetes in my book. But I would see them having been put on metformin, often by a naturopath. I would see fasting insulins being checked multiple times. And I did not know why somebody might make those choices. I did not know why it would be helpful to look at someone's fasting insulin level. I did not know why would you treat a disease in a pre-disease state with a drug that is FDA approved to treat the disease. I didn't have enough information to be able to understand why somebody was doing that. But as I learned about obesity and learned about insulin resistance, I was able to say, oh, well, that's why somebody might make this choice and this choice and this choice. And that's why they might be looking at these things that I've never looked at before. And that's why this pattern that I used to see all the time, where somebody would come in and they'd say, oh, I'm gaining weight and I don't know what's going on. I think I have diabetes. I'm worried about it. It's in my family. And I would see that they had a very low hemoglobin A1C and a very high fasting blood sugar. And I would look at that and I would say, well, no, it looks okay. But it happened over and over again that I would tell them, yeah, no, it looks okay, because I didn't have tools and resources to be able to understand that. And then next year they would be pre-diabetic according to the A1C because their body had fallen out of balance, right? The high insulin level that I didn't know was there because I was not looking for it had now not been able to keep that A1C very suppressed, and therefore their blood sugars were creeping up, right? That is a very practical example, but there was a whole area that I did not know anything about that I had to unlearn my biases. I had to be open to having new information. And I'm not going to lie, it took some time for that to happen. But that was me looking at non-traditional resources, reading books, listening to podcasts, yes, taking some dedicated CME and, choosing to get another certification, right? It was all a process. But in order to do that, of course, I had to be willing to learn and willing to unlearn some things that were incorrect. Same is true with menopause medicine. I started in medical school in 2003, and the WHI had just the year before told everyone that hormones were evil, right? So there's that vacuum where everybody had thrown hormones away, and there was so little education that was helping women. And now we have this whole population of women who never had access to hormones and, will age very differently from women in my generation who are going to have the benefit of knowing what hormones can and can't do and knowing the potential harms of not having access to hormones for the prevention of osteoporosis, for probably the prevention of cardiometabolic and dementia, let alone treating symptoms of menopause, right? It is a very different era, but it also takes listening to voices that are outside the traditional medicine as new information has been coming through. So again, thinking for yourself, who is doing this work? Where have they learned from? Where can I learn from? Who do I want to learn from? Can I hear new information? Am I open to that? Am I willing to vet the sources? Am I willing to have been wrong before and to learn new things? These are all excellent and important questions that we have to ask ourselves. And again, I'm just going to highlight, especially in this era that we're moving into, where traditional resources are at least somewhat compromised by politics and anti-vaccine agendas, right? This is an unprecedented time, not to say that there haven't been other major challenges in medicine, because my friends, they're there. But I don't think we've ever had such an attack on vaccines, such an attack on public health measures, such a reversion where the word diversity gets funding pulled from institutions, right? There are just very serious things going on. And without delving into the politics, just to say that you will have to figure out, who am I going to trust? How will I vet information? As AI tools become more ubiquitous in medicine, will I trust them? How will I be able to check that information? How will I be able to check the information that my learners are presenting to me so that I know that their information is also coming from credible sources? And thinking as well, because we don't want to dwell on, oh God, that sounds hard. What is the gain? For myself, I am incredibly grateful to be able to practice medicine in the way that I'm choosing to do so now. It is not perfect, of course. I still work in an insurance model and, suffer the vagaries that brings, right? Because insurance companies can just decide not to pay me. And because I am paid a portion of the billing that is collected from the visits that I have, if the insurance company doesn't pay, that means I don't get paid. And there's not a lot of recourse for that. And it is a very real hole in our medical system. Again, that's a whole different podcast episode in and of itself. But because I am independent, because I am an independent contractor in a private practice who is able to have autonomy, I am able to decide how I practice medicine. I am able to decide how I integrate evidence, how I integrate things that are emerging. How do I keep myself up to date? What resources do I look at? Who do I pay to learn from? And all of those things feel incredibly empowering. No longer am I in this hierarchical system that tells me I have to learn only from these resources or only in this way or only listen to voices like these. I invite you to figure out, what does this mean for you? How will you learn new information? What do you want to learn so that you can feel fulfilled, that you can feel like you have autonomy over what it is that you choose to do, because our work is always going to be hard. Our work is always going to be challenging. We are always going to be facing the very real dilemmas of bodies that did not read the book and show up with all the challenges, all of the symptoms, all of the human emotions fueling them. If we want to be able to meet the moment, if we want to be able to take care of our patients, what is it that we need to be able to do? How will we learn? Who will we learn from? And hopefully have some fun along the way. My friends, that is the show for this week. I hope that whether you are learning more information, whether you are getting ready in your household to help people go back to school, I hope that this has been a helpful way for us to think about education, ways for us to think about learning. I didn't even get to what I was going to talk about, which is how did we learn as kids? But it's fine. It's fine, because one thing that podcasting has taught me is that you never have to have it all mapped out. You don't always have to know where it's going to go for it to be a good conversation. Until next week, my friends, take care.
Well, that's our show for today. Thank you as always for listening. To learn more about my coaching programs, head to www.healthierforgood.com. And if you love this podcast, please drop us a review on iTunes or support the show by clicking the link in the show notes. Until next time, take care.